and welcome to FortiGuard Live. I'm Derek Mankey, Vice President, Global Threat Intelligence, and I am joined today with not only my co-worker and colleague, Jonas Walker, who's Global Security Strategist with us at FortiGuard Labs, but a good friend of mine. How you doing, Jonas?
It's good to be here, Derek. Doing well, back from traveling quite a bit, back in Singapore, but doing this podcast now with you. Happy to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. It's great to talk on the stage, as it were. There's always so many good discussions we have offline, and there's always so much to talk about. So many things that we're looking at. One thing I wanted to talk about today with you is a big word out there in the industry, convergence. And we hear it with networking and security, and convergence versus consolidation, all the good stuff that's happening, and really the necessity that's happening on the blue team, right? The defender side. And certainly that's happening within security fabrics and platforms and all that stuff as a result of, the drivers that's really happening from the threat landscape, right? We always see that the need for technology and security is being driven from what the bad guys are up to, right? And the threat actors. I think you're quite familiar with that. And one of the concepts I know that I've been having with CISOs, and I'm sure you have as well in your travels, is this: what's happening on the threat landscape, and I refer to this as a phenomenon, right? But what's happening is the convergence of the threat landscape, right? So if we look about what's, focusing on the threat landscape, what are you seeing when it comes to convergence for threats? Between, let's say, cybercrime and advanced persistent threats, nation state threat actors.
Yeah, I think you mentioned a really good point. Like whatever we see like in the normal legitimate business side is slowly or sometimes even very fastly adapting on the malicious side. We've seen with like as service subscriptions from normal businesses being adapted by the criminal side, and now similarly with the convergence. So on one hand we have like APT groups, and APT groups in a nutshell are groups with deep pockets, a lot of resources, super skilled engineers. And it's more often about espionage, sabotage, about getting control. And then on the other side, we have like these cybercrime groups, which are more often than not financially motivated. And in there, you have different kind of threat actors. But what we see these days is that some of the tools, techniques, and also malware is being used from both parties together. So it seems like this convergence of different kind of threat actors out there, which makes it much more tougher for the people on the defensive side.
Yeah, let's talk about that a little bit more. So, what you're talking about is, so first of all, I completely agree. Like, and this resonates, by the way. I've had similar conversations with CISOs, but the APTs, right, the nation states, these are typically a much smaller share of attack activity that we see, right? I mean, certainly it's out there. These are the premeditated, long and slow attacks. Typically a handful, or usually just one target that they're going after. A lot of time spent on the reconnaissance phase, right? Blueprinting networks, knowing, especially when it comes to critical infrastructure, OT-based attacks, right? Knowing what devices they have, what versions are running, applications are running, what ones are vulnerable, how they can create a 0-day to get into those systems. All of that takes a lot of time, right? And it's usually reserved for those deep funded, as you said, nation states. But with the cybercrime world, which is the majority, let's say 95% plus of attack activity that we see, they are now following similar sort of techniques, right? Because we've seen that. We've seen more 0 days and weaponization of threat from cyber criminals. We've seen more of the reconnaissance happening, right? It's actually part of their playbook development now, if you think about it, right? Because on the playbook, they are looking at how they can go after their targets, not just for ransomware and data crypting, right? But for extortion, double extortion. We've seen the rise of wiper threats. We can talk about that as well too. But this is really becoming commoditized, right? And a regular day for cyber criminals.
Yeah, definitely. And you mentioned wipers, and I have a few words here for sure regarding that specific topic. Because on one hand, I get some PTSD flashbacks from 2012. I have a personal experience with the Shamoon attack back then, like this virus, this viper targeting the biggest oil company in the world, Saudi Aramco. And I remember it very well because I was literally standing in a physical store replacing one of my broken hard drives, and I realized hard drives are more expensive 4 years later than when I bought them. And when I did a little of research, I realized that was when the wiper was happening, and this company bought pretty much every single hard drive on this planet. And I think that was a little bit the beginning when we saw wipers. But when you look at today, like this year specifically, and looking back the whole decade, what is your view on wipers like over the last decade versus this year specifically?
Yeah, so wipers, it's funny. First of all, it's really funny how you mentioned you remember what you were doing at what time in 2012. I have the exact same memory actually in 2013, which was another wiper with Dark Soul. These are attacks in South Korea that were happening, if you remember. This was cutting edge technology at the time because it was a wiper. I was actually in Halifax in Canada, which is not in the winter, it's very cold. I love Halifax, I love Canada, but in the winter it's quite dark and cold. So it's probably not a memory that you would remember that would come top of mind, but it does come top of mind because this is as the Dark Soul attacks were happening. I got pulled outside of the conference in talking to our analysts and research group. We had this sample, looked at it. We actually were doing analysis on it at the time, and this was the first time we saw logic bombs put into a wiper. So it had disk wiping capability. It had a time bomb put in. And what happened in that attack was they were going over this didn't happen in a minute or an hour or a day. They were going to multiple targets and deploying these bombs effectively, right? So at a given time, I believe it was in April of that year, all of them went off, all the systems went offline and detonated. And that's actually when the samples started getting distributed. So it was a big deal at the time. And you mentioned Shamoon. I remember that in 2012. As I said, Dark Soul in 2013. There were only about one wiper observation every year following up until this year. So it was, again, far and few in between, thankfully. Unfortunately, now this year, we saw 7 of them just in the first half of this year. And not only that, Jonas, as you know, we follow this with FortiGuard Labs in our telemetry. Those IOCs, like basically the malware hashes, the command and control for those wipers, it's not just limited to one target like you would see with APT groups. Sure, it can start there, but what we're observing, and this is the phenomenon, right, is that with these 7 wipers this year, we're actually seeing that light up like a Christmas tree, to be honest. Like, it's not 1 or 2 detections. We're talking about thousands of detections, in fact, over 24 countries as well, too. That's a big deal, right? And that was just in the first half of this year. Now there's actually more wipers coming on scene in the second half of the year, too. So it's a disturbing trend.
Yeah, I think it highlights as well the convergence which we have been talking about, because apparently in the past it was mainly used by APT groups, but now we see cybercrime groups leveraging these techniques combined with their traditional form of attacks, ransomware, because instead of you not getting your data back, they're threatening you, creating these wipers, executing them because they're already in your system and shutting down everything on top of it. So it really comes down to using different kind of techniques and tools from different kind of groups.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So that's definitely the phenomenon that's happening. I would say it's this convergence between the groups themselves, because there's infrastructure set up, the whole crime services, as we know, like crime as a service. All of that stuff is set and ripe for nation state groups to use. And there's actually collaboration behind the scenes happening between these groups as well. And the interesting effect about that is now when I have conversations with, let's say, public sector, in the past, public sector would say, we're focused on APT groups. That's our number one threat. Ransomware, not so much. Private sector, right, on the IT side, we're 100% focused on ransomware and business email compromise and these threats, because that's what hits us day to day. You try to talk to them about APT threats and more of that sophisticated attack technology like wipers, and they would say, we're not concerned about that, right? We're focused on the cybercrime. Now that conversation is changing, right? Public sector is absolutely concerned about the private sector attacks, ransomware, BEC, and so forth, where the private sector now is also waking up and concerned about, APC effectively, right? Like the advanced persistent threats. It's a higher level of risk too, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. I think we are at the point in time where you can't just say, I'm only worried about this kind of attacks or that kind of attacks. You need to be prepared against both of them. since it's quite overlapping as well. And it's you need to have a very high risk appetite if you only look at one of them, which I would personally not recommend, because we see the attack surface getting bigger and bigger, and this means for cybercrime groups and APT groups, both of them, to have more capabilities from the offensive side. So we need to step up the games on the defensive side. Similarly, like how they are expanding, we need to expand as well. When you look at that, what kind of recommendations, when you say you have these conversations with the CISO, what are usually the topics you bring up first when they ask for advice?
Risk. I mean, you have to speak their language, right? When talking to CISO. So everything we just talked about, just think about it. The level of risk has never been this high, right? Because now we're talking not just about ransomware and data cryptors, which CISOs are used to now, mostly, right? It's been around for a decade. So they've put in, segmentation, backup strategies, things like that, right? But then the extortion playbook came out, double extortion. And those are things now that they're starting to prepare for and get into everything from shoring up defense on the left side to incident response and planning, having a plan, right, for incident response so that they can engage. Those are the conversations we have been having, but now the conversations with the CISO is starting to shift to this, like saying, hey, if these wipers are coming, this is a very high level of risk. You can't wait, right? You really have to focus more on the preventative side, because if you don't, it's too late. I mean, we're talking about wipers, right? That take out systems, even in some cases to the point of flashing, firmwares, turning devices into paperweights, which can cause a lot of damage, right? So collateral damage is higher, risk is higher. And so what that means is now the conversation with, CISOs and security professionals is shifting to the preventative side more, right? How can we deal with those tough challenges, like when an attacker is looking at you, when they're doing reconnaissance on you, when they are doing weaponization, i.e. creating zero-day threats. The number one tactic we're seeing, we put this in our threat landscape report, as you know, Jonas, is defense evasion. 59.2% on defense evasion tactics that we observe. That's a lot. So that's really the conversation. And so what that translates into is, how do we focus more on the left side of the kill chain, pre-attack? And so there's a lot more conversation now happening with next generation SOC. There's a skills gap, as you know, out there. So it's about leveraging things like SOC as a service, DRPS, which is digital risk protection service, looking out on the dark web, looking at chatter to see what attackers are trying to know about you, right? And then, of course, one of our, I know you really love this technology, deception technology, right? Because it's a great solution to that, isn't it?
Yeah, I like how you mentioned the left side of the kill chain. So we talk about the reconnaissance phase here, where it's about understanding what kind of information is out there, what do we know about our potential target. And also when we look at the whole time from attackers specifically regarding the whole kill chain, usually the vast majority of the time is actually spent on reconnaissance. Most of these attacks, especially from APT groups, they have like 20, 30 people spending months, 8 hours a day, 10 hours a day, figuring out what kind of companies, victims, their targets they're dealing with. And they have so much time and resources available, and the more time we spend to plan an attack, the more likely it is for someone to be successful. I remember the famous words my dad always told me: 80% of your success lies in preparation, and I strongly believe in offensive security it's the same. The better you're prepared, the more likely it is you will succeed later when time is short and everything will happen quite quickly.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And it's the proverbial know your enemy, right? But it applies now to cybercrime. Why? Because these attacks we're seeing are becoming more targeted, simply, right? And that's a big part of the game of targeted attacks, is knowing the attack surface, knowing your victim from the eyes of an attacker, of course, which is now, as I said, focusing more on that reconnaissance phase too. So the 0-day aspect too, as I said, there's still a lot. This has been going on a long time, as you know, but when it comes to malware, as I said, they're trying to get around security, defense evasion, trying to get around security controls. So being able to have 0-day prevention is also key. Everything from CTNA and zero trust to segmentation, as we talked about before, but also having inline sandboxing. It's a new technology, right? That doesn't have to wait 2 minutes for a sandbox request to come back and say this is bad, because if you have a wiper threat in the system, game over. It's too late at that point, right? So being able to do deep content inspection at speed to be able to, block traffic. Of course, AI powered security operations like machine learning and AI also falls into that bucket too. Those are all becoming critical conversations now. And also, investment points with CISOs. The other thing too is this is now bubbling up to the board, right? Because it's a risk conversation. So this is absolutely becoming more topical when it comes to board level conversations too, right?
Yeah, I do believe though that's a really good trend because, and personally, I think security needs to be top of mind. It needs to be supported from all the way from the top, because if we try to implement security afterwards, like at later stages, we really run into the problem which you mentioned very well. Speed is king. It's about if you're late, it doesn't take too long these days with a lot of automated tools, with a lot of machine learning technologies to understand what is out there, what is vulnerable, and how to exploit them on pattern, which we have seen in the past. And these systems are becoming more and more trained, similar like we train our systems on the defensive side with all the samples we have been gathering for the last 20 years. We know how malware looks like, what kind of patterns, and we are capable of making very quick decisions, whether when something new comes in to decide, does it look suspicious or not. But we need to keep in mind that the offensive side is capable of using similar techniques as well at some point.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's another effect we're seeing, isn't it? Is the speed and agility of these attacks is also increasing because these targeted attacks aren't the Stuxnet era of 2010 that take 2 years to develop. I mean, these are coming much more fast and furious. So I'm glad that you mentioned automation, though. That's another piece we haven't talked about. That's also a very key piece to this, right? With SIM and SOAR, that's all part of that next generation SOC. You can't win this fight just with scaling with headcount and humans, right? You definitely need that automation piece in the SOC too. That's a key component. Well, hey, Jonas, I really want to thank you for your time. Appreciate it. It's always great conversations with you. We talked about some of the effect we're seeing, which is always the bad news, but there is some good news that we talked about, like this conversation now becoming a focus point more to the board level. There are actual relevant solutions to this today that didn't really exist, 5 years ago as well too. So all good things there. For all the viewers out there, thanks for joining us. You can view all the latest content from our threat research on our blog at blog.fortinet.com. Once again, I'm Derek Manky, joined by Jonas. Thanks for your time, Jonas. It's another episode of FortiGuard Live. We'll talk to you later.